Now, how do injuries occur? So we've talked about how the body moves, and we've talked about a little bit about stress in a recap. So in an acute standpoint, injury occurs, as we talked about, because it exceeds tissue tolerance. It's an overuse. We've overused the tissue. We've exceeded its capacity in that moment. What's happened is essentially we've had too much either load, repetition, or unknown movement, which unaccustomed stress that's been placed on the body. It's just been too much for the system at that time. The body was basically not prepared or able to do what it is told to do. It's as easy as that. What causes that? Three primary things. Number one, lack of knowledge of the current stress or fatigue level. We had no clue what the readiness of that person was if you're training yourself or if you're working with athletes or clients. If you don't know where they're at, then you have no idea whether you're placing too much or too little or about the right amount of stress on them. Number two, an improper warm-up and or recovery strategy. This is absolutely essential as well. Warm-ups are brutal in the industry. I'm just gonna be flat out honest. They're brutal because we don't have a rhyme or reason for a warm-up. We just say we're gonna move. But then we go to a workout and we put all this attention on what movements we're gonna use, what exercises we're gonna use, what's all this, but we don't do anything for that in the warm-up. We just swing our legs and we move our arms and shoulders and we do stuff and we think as long as the body is warm, temperature-wise, then it's gonna function. That's not the case. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're actually gonna have a whole webinar on that coming up in October on how to create a more specific warm-up, more functional warm-up per person, more personalized. Okay, so lack of knowledge, we have no clue what the readiness is. Number two, horrible warm-up. If the warm-up is accurate, we actually you put the body in a position to tolerate more stress, and you're actually able to decrease how much stress the body is going to incur. That becomes more negative. That's what a warm-up should do. For us, we just think if it just increases sweat, we're good. And then programming strategy. And programming strategy is tied to all of that. What did I do with the person? What was the volume of the training session? And that's because I had a lack of knowledge of where they currently were, okay? All right, from a chronic standpoint, this one's gonna get a little bit detailed, so stay with me. Number one, they're under-recovered, means they have increased fatigue. When you have chronic injury, you have whether it's plantar fasciitis, whether you have a nagging hamstring issue, whether you have shoulder pain, pick one. The body is under-recovered. It has not gotten to a state of recovery, and that means there's increased fatigue / stress in the system, which means the inflammation has been prolonged. So we're talking about prolonged inflammation. That decreases what we talked about, that alpha gamma coactivation. That means we no longer have the instant activation to where the muscles are turning on. Those type 1 motor units are no longer turning on when they're supposed to. This means that we've had decreased muscle spindle sensitivity. That muscle spindle cannot shorten. It's got what we call slack in it. So if you see in this diagram, if you can see that, you'll see that there's on the far right with the yellow circle around it, there's a spindle that's just kind of hanging there. So think of yourself fishing. You take a fishing line and you throw it in the water. What's the first thing you do with the fishing line when you throw it in the water? You reel out the slack. Why? Because if there's slack in the line and a fish grabs a line, you have no idea if there's a fish on the line because there's so much slack. It could go for 10, 20 meters, 10, 20 yards or so before you grab, oh, there was something happen. That's slack. If there's slack in the spindle, it means the body's moving, but it has no idea that it's moving because it's not getting feedback. So it can't be stable. So when you reel that slack in, now you have a tight or taut line. You have instant connection. So as soon as a fish grabs the bait, boom, you can feel it and you can actually react. That's exactly what happens to muscle spindles. So when we have prolonged inflammation knocks the muscle spindle offline and it decreases that alpha gamma coactivation. So the muscle can no longer react in its instant timing. When that happens, that cascades down, we no longer have proprioception. We don't have that immediate ability to respond and produce a good movement pattern. Now we have decreased sensory motor integration. We're not able to get input in and good input out. and we've decreased reciprocal inhibition, which means we now have an unstable joint. That's what causes the instability, and that's where we have also changes in our type 1 metabolic characteristics. They change. So we have delayed activation, quicker to fatigue, instability. So what does that result in? Pay attention to this, because this is the ultimate piece of information. When we have all of this happens, which is a result of prolonged inflammation, it's not if it will happen, it's usually when it's going to happen. And it will happen for most people. It's just some people, depending on their level of tolerance, can go longer, and a lot of people can't. But if you have nagging aches and pains, that means that you're in that state right there. It's resulted in weakened muscle tissue. We no longer have proper proprioception, muscle spindle activity. The muscle is in a weakened state. It cannot respond properly. It does not have the ability to activate on time when it needs to. This decreases what's called, this is just a fancy word, a reflex-mediated stiffness. It means the muscle no longer has the ability to properly activate to stabilize a joint. It can no longer be turned on to stiffen the tissue that's supposed to support our joints. It no longer has the ability to create the tension that it needs in order for the connective tissue to transfer that and hold the joint in its place. Muscles produce the force. The connective tissue just transfers that. If we don't have immediate turn on, we don't have the ability for the joint to be in a stable position with active control from the muscular system. Destabilized joint, and it's the destabilized joint and the lack of proprioception and the weakened muscle that actually leads to muscle tightness. Muscle tightness is a protective mechanism because of the altered reciprocal inhibition, and that's how we get decreased range of motion. So we always look at decreased range of motion as we got tight muscles, but where did that come from? It came from the weakened muscle. It came from prolonged inflammation that knocks it offline and causes this, and I'm gonna show you research on that here in a second. So just think now, if my muscle spindle isn't giving me information and I'm trying to extend my knee, as soon as that muscle spindle goes offline, because it may give me, and that's why people don't get tight at the beginning ranges of motion. So when someone's trying to extend their knee, it's not like instantly the knee can't move. It goes out, and then all of a sudden it gets tight more towards the end range. Why? Because that spindle can't shorten fully. So when that spindle stops giving information to the nervous system, that's when there's no longer an inhibition, the reciprocal inhibition of the opposing muscle groups to be decreased or to turn off. And so they turn on. And that's why all of a sudden they turn on. So the issue is the spindle is no longer activated. If you reboot that spindle, you'll get the tissue, the opposing tissue, to remain off or in a decreased state, so you have full range of motion and you'll have a stable joint. So the note here is inflammation, the prolonged inflammation, leads directly to muscle weakness. And that weakness is what causes the muscle tightness. So if you address the weakness, you will remove the tightness. That's neurophysiology. And we'll go more. I'll explain that more. What's the cause of chronic injury? Incomplete, improper recovery strategies. That's it. It's the body hasn't been put in a position to allow itself to recover because it's still moving. Even though you may have technology that says that you're in a good state of readiness, and this is where technology hasn't caught up to the body yet, because the body's designed far greater than technology is. If you have a Whoop or you have some type of technology, whether it's heart rate variability, or whether you have, even if you're using some type of velocity-based training, and wow, they can still move as fast, that doesn't mean, or you have a good readiness score, that doesn't mean that everything that's supposed to be working is going to work right. That's why those won't necessarily eliminate or overcome some of these nagging injuries just by doing that, because you can still present as strong. But strength doesn't necessarily mean that everything is working the way it's supposed to, that's why things get broken. That's why athletes get broken. And let's face it, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, and you'll see at the end, has come from Greg Roscoff and what's called muscle activation technique, and you have access to that, and I'll talk about that at the end. But he's been doing this for 20 years. He's so far ahead of the game. But the essential thing that we have to realize is stress is not just physical. Life is going to beat you up, and you will succumb to stress, whether you like it. It doesn't matter how mentally strong you are, how emotionally strong you are. You'll get so much stress that the body is going to break down. And what I love about what Greg has always said is that when it breaks down, you need to have someone there to put it back together, or to turn it back on, or to connect the battery cables, or to reel in the slack on the line. If you don't know how to do that, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot, and or we're just being inefficient and wasting time, and we can get to that. And what we're talking about here, this is something that I have used personally with clients, and I've used personally on myself in 2 different capacities, and I've also had Greg work on me. So I've seen this work in 3 different mediums, 1 from the expert and 2 from a knucklehead like me, who's gotten amazing results with what we're going to talk about today. And that's why I'm so passionate about helping you to get that with yourself and or your clients. So let's go a little step farther. Let's look at the stress response to training, because most people don't even understand this. So when we train, and this is, yes, especially with eccentric contractions, because most people do that, but it's even with concentric contractions, just not to the degree. There's a normal level of inflammation. That's the red line you'll see with those triangles. There's a normal inflammation response, and we want that. You have to have that. But there's also, because of that, there's going to be a hindrance in your strength and range of motion. That's what's circled down there below. Strength and range of motion will decrease. This is in a normal training situation. The pain, which is the open triangle, and the range of motion are correlated. So inflammation causes pain. Pain is a result of inflammation. So as soon as we start getting inflammation, after the inflammation is kicked in, all of a sudden pain starts going up really high. There's a correlation between that, which all that means is that there's an inflammation response and your decreased range of motion. That's normal. So in a normal case, as the inflammation rises, it's cleaning and repairing. So you can see everything's starting to reduce. And if this went longer, you would see that they would come back to a baseline or change. So the inflammation is necessary because inflammation brings healing to the body. That's how the body heals, is through inflammation. Inflammation decreases the muscle's ability to activate, though. That's why we lose range of motion. When we can't decrease the inflammation and get it out soon enough or completely or to the right level, that's where we have the continued deactivation. That's how the muscle spindle gets knocked offline, and all of a sudden we lose the ability to move into a motion, which means we lose reciprocal motion, and that's how we get tightness somewhere else. Okay? So now looking at inflammation, I already told you it'll short circuit your alpha gamma coactivation. It'll knock the spindles offline, especially in the type 1 muscle fibers, because they're the lowest threshold, and it'll cause poor proprioception. This is just a study that shows, and this is actually a great article, and it lays out everything in perfect, and the references down there. All these things, but I highlighted inflammation because aging, cancer, infection, pain, trauma, those are all related to inflammation. So they should have just put inflammation are known to be associated with impaired proprioception. And remember, proprioception means that the body is no longer able to have proper input, so it can't have proper output. That's what it's saying. It means that we have knocked the spindle offline, is what that's saying. Inflammation has knocked the spindle offline, because this is actually an article about spindles. So this puts the muscle in a weakened state, unable to contract on demand, and the muscle spindles are no longer sending the proper signals. So here you can see that this disruption that we talked about, the whole inflammation and the lack of proprioception, can be seen in the movements and the muscle activation that's not being effectively produced to create the proper outcome of things turning on and turning off is what it's talking about. Things aren't turning on and turning off, so what's happening is everything's starting to lock down. And that's where we get the altered muscle spindle input, alters reciprocal inhibition, causing tightness in opposing muscles, and that's what it's referring to here with the lack of degrees of freedom. It means we no longer can move to the way that we're supposed to move. We don't have the range of motion because inflammation has knocked the spindle offline, altering proprioception, altering information to the brain. Sensory motor integration is no longer working because we have a bad input, we're going to have a bad output, which means we've altered reciprocal inhibition. We no longer can get things to turn on and turn off properly. So we have tightness. So note, muscle weakness causes a destabilized joint, which leads to the tightness in opposing muscle groups and lack of range of motion. Okay. Now, in a prolonged stress response, here's what happens. Here's just kind of a very simplistic chain of what happens. When we have this prolonged stress response, means we have prolonged stress response and prolonged inflammation. We've altered the immune system function. We have the inability to downregulate inflammation, which is the #1 factor promoting musculoskeletal injury and all major diseases for that matter. 2, it decreases recruitment of type 1 muscle fibers and muscle spindles. That decreases our stability or proprioception, which is how we ultimately get mobility. Mobility shouldn't be thought of as range of motion. It should be thought of as actively controlled range of motion is what it should be thought. We think if I can just get more motion to happen, that means that I have mobility. No, it just means you got more motion to happen. That's typically what we do a lot of times by doing aggressive maneuvers, aggressive mobility drills, or aggressive stretching tactics. You can gain range of motion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually proprioceptive or you've gotten proper proprioception out of that range of motion. And that's the difference. And it's not that stretching and mobility drills and all that, those aren't bad. The exercise is never the problem. It's the person or the prescription of those for that person that becomes the problem. Did they do them, one, in a proper order, or did they do them to the right ability level of who they're working with or themselves? That's the issue. Exercises aren't problems. It's how they're used that becomes the problem. That's a human error. The third thing is we have dehydrated connective tissue. When we have a prolonged stress response, the connective tissue is now dehydrated. So let's walk through this. I have inflammation. I have decreased muscle contraction ability. I can't turn the muscles on at the right time to stabilize the joint. Muscles work with connective tissue, your fascial matrix. Muscles produce force. Connective tissue only transfers force. If the muscle can't turn on at the right time, that joint's still moving because it's either responding to forces placed upon it or it's being told to move. So it's gonna move, and if we have a delay, that means you have an unstable joint. The connective tissue is still attached to that joint. So the connective tissue is now trying to do the job that the muscle is supposed to be doing and helping it with. So now there's more force placed on connective tissue, but the connective tissue is dehydrated, so it no longer has the capacity to actually transfer or sustain force, or what we call stiffen properly. So if I have poor tissue and poor muscle, now the connective tissue is where all the stress is being placed on. What's the #1 tissue in the body that's injured in musculoskeletal injury? Connective tissue. That's why. And it's not because the connective tissue is weak. It's because the muscle isn't firing on time. It's not activated. That's where the issue lies.